really difficult time to continue to move educational projects forward, right? It's been a difficult time to move lots of things forward, but this week I have been really buoyed by the fact that in spite of all of those challenges, that's exactly what has been happening in a really interprofessional way. I was so excited to hear presentations from our faculty across the campus, from programs in physical therapy, from the nursing school, from our dental colleagues, from faculty in the medical school, and also from a number of students as well. It really made me feel extremely proud of what's happening here at the University of Colorado, even more so in the context of everything that's been happening in the world. And so that, I think, is a perfect way to talk about the bittersweet moment that we're at here, where we're celebrating both the life of Dr. J.J. Cohen and the legacy he left us, but also missing him in a really important way because of how much this new curriculum that we've launched in the MD program meant to him. I'm going to save that for later this evening and instead move on to introducing our keynote speaker for this week, Dr. Zoe Cohen, who is an associate professor of physiology and medical sciences in the College of Medicine, Tucson at the University of Arizona. She teaches undergraduate, graduate, and medical students and was awarded the 5-Star Teaching Award, the only student-nominated award at the University of Arizona. Her love of teaching, she comes by it naturally, we'll just say, modeling much after the teaching style of her father, Dr. J.J. Cohen. So from student to teacher to student, Dr. Cohen is going to share with us her expertise around active learning, something that we value incredibly here. Thanks so much for your attention today.
All right. So can you see the slides on Zoom? Good? Awesome. Okay. You can hear me on Zoom? I don't know if they can.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I do want to thank you again for inviting me here today, especially during their education week at the University of Colorado, something that means a lot to me and meant a lot to my dad as well. So I'm very excited to get to share with you a little bit about what I've learned about teaching from my dad, from the literature, as well as from my students. And I'm lucky, I think I have some students on the Zoom call, which makes me very excited. Now this isn't working. Hold on 1 sec. Out. We're in. First rule of education is that you go with the flow if things don't actually work. There we go. Awesome. It always works at some point. That's the other take-home message. Oh, we're out again. Oh, that's right. That's right. It's a quick room change as well as it's always technical. There we go. Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So I wanted to start with this quote that I actually think is it might sound a little odd in an education talk, but I really believe it has a lot to say about education. So Maya Angelou said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And this quote really has sort of two messages to me. The first, it reminds me of my dad. I look around this room, I see people who he taught, I see people who he mentored, I see friends and family. And you might remember some facts that he's taught you over the years, but what do you really remember? You remember the passion. You remember the excitement he had for any topic that he wanted to talk about. And that, to me, is what makes a great teacher. So that's really sort of my second point about this quote is, to me, a teacher isn't a person who just shares information, right? Anyone can look up information. We all have a phone in our pockets now. What you need is somebody to impart passion, to impart that excitement about a topic that makes you then want to go on and learn the facts and spend the time learning the information. So to me, that's the major goal of a teacher. So I found the Webster's definition of what a teacher is, right? It's probably the lamest definition I've ever heard. One who teaches, okay, right? And one whose occupation it is to instruct. So that doesn't really tell us anything, right? Again, I don't think a teacher really should be the person standing in front of a group and imparting facts. I think it should be a joint effort between the person who maybe knows a little bit more and the people who are there to learn a little bit more. I found this quote, I thought it was good for a medical school, right? Teaching is the highest art. Before the doctor, there was the teacher, right? And I do that for my medical students who are on the call right now. So never forget me. That's a big point. All right. I was doing some reading, and this thought or this question came up quite often. Are good teachers born or are good teachers made? Right? It's a debate. A lot of people are trying to figure this one out. I'm going to say that maybe people have some innate ability, but I think everybody can learn to be a better teacher. So saying that, I'm going to back up and say, if there was ever a born instructor, there was ever a born teacher, it's going to be this guy here, my dad, right? JJ or John Cohen. He taught me so much, and I'll talk about a little bit about sort of some of the things he taught me on the next slide. But I'm sure I'm not the only person who thinks their parents were their first teachers, right? But I think I lucked out in the teaching game quite a bit. In fact, my first job, the picture over on the left, I was probably, I'm going to guess maybe 11, and I started working in my dad's lab, washing dishes with boric acid as an 11-year-old. And this was nothing weird for my dad because my dad also started working in a laboratory at around 11 at the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal. So it comes naturally to the family to stick kids in dangerous situations early on. But when I wasn't washing dishes, he'd let me do little experiments in the lab. And it was these little experiments that made me think, I'm going to be an immunologist. Right? I was the kid who everyone else wanted to be a policeman or a doctor. And I would say, can I be an immunologist? And they would say, that doesn't fit in any song. And so I always had to do something else. But I loved immunology, and I loved immunology because of the passion he showed me about immunology. I finally decided to not major in immunology. I majored in physiology, and I minored in immunology. So I'm not 100% a mini-me, although I'm thinking a lot of people might debate that, especially if you've taken my immunology class and his immunology class. And I know this was always a bummer to my mom, right, that I wanted to be an immunologist and never a nurse. And she always was hoping that I would take after her. But like I said, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the lab, how to interact with people from working in his lab. But what else did I learn from my dad? Obviously, I learned science. I learned how to read science. I learned how to conduct science, right? And I learned how to talk about science. Picture his hands. If you're an immunologist, you get it. It's a T-cell receptor, an MHC. But he taught me a lot of other things, too. He taught me a lot about the world that we live in. He taught me that mushroom spores can make beautiful art. He taught me how to distinguish seed-eating birds from bug-eating birds. Taught me the joy of riding bikes. I really liked it, as you can tell from that picture. And of course, he taught me how to teach. So to me, one of the things that I've taken from him is teaching is a passion, and sharing that with others is a passion. It's my passion, just like it was my dad's passion. How do we teach? So sort of, I'm going to obviously back and forth between my dad and what we actually know. The easiest way that we know to teach is pretty much what I'm doing right now, right? A lecture, where one person stands in front and just talks at everybody. The term lecture first showed up in the 14th century. Okay? It comes from the Latin legere, which means to read. And what you can see, the picture on the left is a painting from the 14th century called The Lecture, and it depicts just that from the University of Bologna in Italy. And you've got the teacher sitting up at the lectern, which of course also comes from the same root, to read, and the students sitting there listening, doing exactly what students do, right? You can see the ones in the front row are paying attention, right? You can see the second row, there's a guy in the back sort of trying to get the girl next to him to chat. You get a little bit further back, we've got some sleepers, right? Just like today. Nothing's changed in however many centuries. The picture on the right is the anatomy lecture that Rembrandt wrote, or that drew, excuse me. And this is maybe a little bit different, right? You can see, again, the teacher, the one with the hat, is sort of showing what he's doing, and the students are gathered around and looking. So this might be a little bit more like active learning, and we'll talk about active learning in a couple of slides. Fortunately for us, and especially those of us who have grown up having lectures given to us, and then the easy part of teaching is just doing exactly what we have been taught our entire lives, is that lectures aren't always the best way to impart information. Right? I like this quote quite a bit. It's attributed to Mark Twain. It says, "College is a place where a professor's lecture notes go straight to the student's lecture notes without passing through the brains of either." All right? And unfortunately, that's true in many, many cases. Right? If I'm just standing up here reading and you're just writing what I say, there's nobody playing a job. And this is true, I think, on undergraduate campus. And of course, when I say undergraduate, I realize we're in a college of medicine here. You think of first and second year medical students. I think of real undergraduate students in a bachelor's programs. But this is true for real undergraduates, undergraduate medical students, graduate students, wherever you go. An author named Bly wrote a paper called "What's the Use of Lectures?" And he states, and I do have to sort of read this a little bit, that lectures are a conception where the teacher who knows things shares that information with students who don't know things and doesn't take into consideration any of what the student brings to the table. And I think that's the big problem with lecturing. Lecturing is a one-way street. We really want to get a two-way street going. We want to know the students come with experiences, they come with life stories, and all of that should play a role in education. I do want to point out that not all lecturing is bad. Right? We were taught this way. I think this is also one of the reasons it's hard to break habits, and we all did okay. Right? They're relatively easy to set up. You can cover a lot of information to a lot of people in a relatively short time. Right? That's going to be a little different than when you get into sort of more active lecturing. So are there other ways of teaching? Yes, yes, luckily, and as Shanta mentioned, that we do a lot of it here as well, but active learning really is a method of learning where students play a part in the process as well. 1991, Bonwell and Eisen wrote that when all it needs for it to be active learning is for the students to do something, right? To not just sit there passively and listen. So it can mean reading, it can mean writing things down, it can mean discussing with your neighbor or a group of people, or it can be solving problems. All of those make up active learning. And it's kind of interesting when you think about it. If you think way back, or for some of us way back, right, to kindergarten, right, or elementary school, or even maybe high school and college, we did this. This is how we learned, right? And then higher education just sticks you in a room and makes you listen. Okay? What we're seeing is almost, I say, a bottom-up trickle of active learning into higher education now, right? We realize it works, and that is very exciting. Why is it taking so long to get to higher education? Change is hard, right? It takes effort. It takes time to take a traditional lecture and convert it into an active learning course. Can't cover as much material. It's impossible. If you want students to talk, you're not going to be able to cover as much. So you have to be a little bit more picky about what you think is important to cover. And lastly, students don't always like it, right? They get annoyed by it. They think they learn less. And that's going to be a hard sell, right? Especially if that's what comes out on your evaluations at the end of the semester. So the question is, do students really learn less when they are put into an active learning situation? Logan and his colleagues did a very cool experiment. This was a college physics class. And what they decided to look at was actual learning compared to the feeling of learning. Did the students actually learn? Did they feel that they learned anything? And what they found was, so what they did is, first let me explain the experiment. They had two classes, one that had the traditional lecture format, one that had active engagement with the students, covered exactly the same material, right? So that was important for this. And then at the end of the course, they tested them. And what they found was that the students in the active engagement course learned more, but felt like they learned less. And the authors postulate that the reason for this is that active learning is hard, right? It's hard for the teacher to put together, but it's hard, it should be hard for the student. The student should have to think, should get to a point where maybe they don't know something, right? And that's not a comfortable place to be. And so the students overall didn't like it, and they felt that they learned less, even though they learned more. I saw this study, and I began to think, I kind of want to turn my classes into active learning classes. Then I got a little worried, right? Because if the students hate it, it's going to be a tough sell for me. So I did. I've moved my classes into active learning. I'll show you a picture of one of our rooms in a moment. And what I got back instead was actually pretty good, happy, helpful feedback, right? So I've sort of highlighted a couple of lines in purple for you, right? The students actually really enjoyed working together. It's helpful to hear thoughts and ideas and interact with other students, right? They had to talk rather than just think. It helped understand the topic more, right? Actually wanted to learn the information. That's always good. I like the bottom one, getting a break from just listening, right? Which I completely understand, because I wouldn't want to listen to myself for that long either. So that was a good thing. Now I had to also figure out, did they learn more in active learning? Oh, before I go there, I did want to show you the top picture here is one of our active learning spaces at the University of Arizona. We call them collaborative learning spaces. what they've done pretty much is retrofit old rooms with tables where students can sit around, and you can see there's sort of monitors all over the place up there. That was our largest room, holds about 250 students. What I put at the bottom is one of the types of questions. So the way I ran my active learning classes is I did very short, say 5 to 7 minute chats with them about something, and then I'd put up a question. There was always a let's discuss button so they knew what to expect. And then I had them either just talk. Sometimes they use whiteboards like this one. And at the bottom picture is just something we found in the room after, which is very nice. Right? It just says we like the space. But did they learn more? Right? They liked the space. They did. These 3 pie charts, and this is preliminary data. I do have more data. Unfortunately, I didn't have it for this talk. These 3 pie charts were when I taught my immunology class. So again, I am a mini-me, and it's identical to my dad's class. A little scary, but these 3 pie charts were when I taught it in a regular lecture format. And these were just the final grade. So this is how I'm sort of looking at knowledge, right? And you can sort of see, a third of the class maybe got A's, relatively large chunk got B's. And you can see the C's and D's, and a small subset of failing grades. This is what happened when I moved to active learning. Overall, the students started doing a lot better. We had a lot more A's. B's pretty much sort of shifted into the A's, I believe, right? The C's shifted into B's. And unfortunately, we still had a couple of students who didn't do that well in the course. But I'm going to talk a little bit about something that I have done since that has sort of helped this group a lot. So it does look like it works, which is a wonderful thing. The students seem to like it, and it actually increases knowledge. This paper is just from Theobald et al. Was really showing that active learning not only increases knowledge, but it can actually shrink gaps between students who are marginalized, who maybe are underrepresented in higher education or medicine, with those that are not. So they actually were able to narrow the margin of knowledge gaps in these groups. And I know this is something that we talk about a lot at the University of Arizona College of Medicine, right? We want to bring in students that are underrepresented in medicine, but we want to make sure they succeed. And it looks like active learning is one way that we can do that. What else can we do to help students? This sort of goes back to the idea that active learning works, but, right, my results were slightly different than Logan's paper, where the students didn't really like active learning. So what's the difference? I think the difference is buy-in. You have to get the students to buy in to any type of new method or teaching protocol or whatever you want. Without buy-in, they're never going to care. So I want to go slightly off topic and tell you a little story about my dad. And it leads into what a teacher can do to help a student learn. So when I started my graduate work at the University of Arizona, I was walking down the hall. I was pretty new in Arizona, and I passed Dr. Jack Nolte, who many of you know because he was here. And I said hi, and he, for whatever reason, kept walking. And I was devastated. I was crushed that Dr. Nolte didn't know who I was. And I went and I called my dad bawling. I was like, he doesn't know who I am. And my dad calmed me down and told me he probably just didn't see you. It's fine. But later on, he told me that interaction that we had was the first time that it occurred to him that students were somebody's children. And that we have to remember that they're not just things in a seat, that they're someone's children and they're emotional and they need a little bit of love. And after he told me that, and when I started teaching, I have never not thought of that. I think of that every single time I walk into a classroom. In fact, as my students would tell you on this call, I take it one step further. I don't think of them as somebody else's children. I sort of just think of them as my kids, right? And I think it's that interaction, that true respect that I have for my students and my students have for me that allows sort of some of this buy-in that I want to talk about a little bit. So that's become sort of my area of interest and my area of happy, is to really sort of figure out how to make students want to learn and to feel part of the process. So these are just a couple of small articles that I've written about this. A big one, and this side over here where it says small ways to help students feel noticed. This is when I was talking about buy-in. I don't wait until the first day of class to start, hyping up my students. I start about 3 weeks before class starts. I start sending emails. Excited to meet you. Let me tell you how the course is going to run. Let me tell you why active learning is important, right? All of these things, they start getting excited, I get excited, and we can hit the ground running once class starts. So I think that's a great way to sort of begin to get to know your students. Another thing, and this goes back to that pie chart where I showed you sort of the students in the, say, the D and E range that didn't really move very much. They tend to be the lost students, right? We tend to gravitate towards the students who are asking questions, that are interested, that are smiling, right? All of those. It's the students that aren't doing well, that are sort of sitting in the back and hiding, right? That we don't really interact with that much. So one of the things that I learned was to start sending individualized emails to students who were not doing well, right? Individualized, it was to each their name, but the bulk of the email stayed the same. And it was pretty much just saying, hey, Joey, we noticed you weren't doing so great in class. Now's the time to let's figure out what's going on and let's fix it. And I was petrified when I first did this, because I thought the thing that was going to come back to me was, well, it's because you didn't teach me right? Or because you're making me talk to my classmates that I didn't learn anything, right? What I ended up getting was, thank you so much. Thank you for reaching out. I've never had a teacher do that before. I'm going to try harder. I'm going to come to class. If I'm going to come to class, that would be great, right? I'm going to come to office hours, right? But it really helped. And again, it was a way of making them feel noticed. I find that very, very important. And the last thing I just want to mention a little bit is share a little bit with your students about your life. Right? You don't have to go into ridiculous detail, but they want to get to know you. If you break down that barrier of teacher-student, you are going to get so much more out of the whole experience. And so are they. I mean, I would say that as weird as this is going to sound, probably, some of my closest friends on this call are either current or former students, because I feel that we've really made a connection. I'm going to come back to that a little bit also at the very end of this. I did want to just sort of bring up medical education a little bit, because, again, most of my work, although I teach in the medical school, a lot of my work is on the undergraduate campus. But I did want to talk a little bit about active learning in medical schools. And I know Shanta said that this is a big thing here. I know a lot of schools do things such as team learning, where small groups of students talk about a problem or something, and then maybe come back to the whole group, right? So there are ways that medical school is involving team learning. I'm going to suggest, of course, that every class is an opportunity to get some active engagement. add those questions, get them involved in the topic. If you give them a list of 900 drugs, they're not going to remember that. Give them a class and let them figure out what goes on in that class of drugs. Get them interested in drugs, and then they'll want to learn it. So to sort of kind of begin to wind this up, can a teacher become a student? I'm going to say 100% yes, right? It has been a crazy last couple of years. It was actually almost to the day 2 years ago. It was our spring break in Arizona, which starts this week, that we all had to start learning new things, right? New tricks. When COVID-19 closed down university and medical campuses, and we were all forced to figure out how to use Zoom, which you can see sometimes we're still trying to figure out, how to engage with students when all we're seeing are little boxes and half the boxes are turned off. How do we interact in this new world with new technologies? So every teacher, I'm going to say, had to become a student of some sort. What my dad and I did during that first semester that we were virtual is we started reaching out to our students. And we just sort of said, how's it going? What's going on? Can you tell us what's working and what's not working? And over and over and over, we heard from the students that they were very stressed out. We were learning new things, we were stressed out, but so were they. They were now isolated, they had gotten used to being with their colleagues, and now they're in their houses trying to learn. And so my dad and I had a really long talk about this, and we said, how can we decrease stress for our students? This is a stressful time. You know, people are getting sick. We don't really want to add to that stress to them. And one big area of stress are exams, right? We know that, and now we're also forcing them to do them online and all of this. So we decided between the two of us that perhaps what we would do is we would get rid of high-stakes exams and move to more frequent but low-stakes exams. So my dad did this in his graduate immunology class. I did this in my undergraduate immunology class as well as my undergraduate cardiovascular class. And I moved from 3 high-stakes exams to 13 weekly low-stakes exams. I called them tests. I thought that was less scary sounding. And this is unbelievably preliminary data. I just pulled it for this talk. But interestingly, when we got rid of the stress of memorizing a lot of material 3 times a semester to learning what we had covered that week and making sure that there was some redundancy, that they were actually sort of rolling, they were increasing their knowledge each time, what you can see here is there was an increase in knowledge when we moved from the 3 exams to the 13 tests. So kind of cool when you think about it. And then, of course, I had to ask the students what they thought about this. And what I got I thought was pretty interesting. They felt that they were able to retain more information. So it wasn't so much, well, I don't have to cover as much on each test. It was, they felt like I had the time to really learn the material because I had to stay up with it. I didn't have to do the cramming at, the day before the big test. So again, I've highlighted a couple of sentences in purple here. Made me more productive and responsible in regards to studying, retaining the material better. This was not just only 2. I didn't just pull the 2 that liked it. It was pretty much unanimous. And because of this, I'm actually staying with this. Now that we're back in person in Arizona, I'm staying with the weekly tests, and hopefully we'll see this trend continue. I do want to bring it full circle to finish this up. I hope that if there was anything that you could take away from this talk, it's that teaching should be about passion. It doesn't have to be specifically about facts. That finding a teaching mentor, like I had with my dad, I think will make a world of difference. Look at the teachers that you really liked. Pick up little tidbits and move forward with them, because I think it makes a huge difference. Remember that teaching and students, it's a two-way street. You're going to get a lot from them, and you're going to give them a lot. And I think if you let them a little bit into your life, you will be amazed at the connections you can make. I'm going to tell you this last one, and I'm thinking I might make it through this without crying, which is a little surprising because I haven't been able to do it yet. But no, I'm not. Okay, that's all right. When my dad first got sick, we'd just gone back into person in teaching in Arizona, and my students were excited. It had been 2 years since they'd been in a classroom. They all came back into the classroom. And then I said, well, I'm flying up to Colorado, and you're going to have to now watch videos again. And, good luck. And I kept them involved. I kept them updated with what was going on in my life and going on with my dad. And did they complain once? No. Again, these are all pre-med students. So the amount of compassion that I received, this is just a very small, I think I have 30 pages of these notes from my students. I carry them with me everywhere now because it makes such a difference to me. Because without them, I don't know how I would have handled this. So let your students know what's going on, because they become a huge source of strength and compassion. And I've learned more about it from them, from my students, in the last few months than I can ever tell you. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you to the University of Colorado for having me come up and talk. It's always nice to be home. I did my bachelor's and my master's at Colorado. So I'm glad that I'm not upset that Colorado beat Arizona in basketball. It's okay. I want to thank Dr. Zimmer and Helen and others for allowing me to come and talk today at an education conference, which my dad would have loved. Again, thank you to all of you here, as well as everybody on Zoom for taking the time during your lunch to listen. Thanks a lot to my physiology students at the University of Arizona for being a huge pillar of strength to me, supporting me here on Zoom. And of course, thanks to my dad for being my mentor, my biggest cheerleader, and my teacher. And the beauty is that his legacy is going to live on in everyone here. So with that, I thank you. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Dr. Cohen, thank you so much. I'm going to moderate the chat, but people here, if you are willing or interested in asking questions or making comments, there's a microphone in front of you. I ask that you use it. One of the flaws of this room is that you have to hold the button down to be able to talk. But first, Dr. Cohen, I want to just say the chat box that you can't see is filling up with hearts and thanks and appreciation and doubling down on the commitment and authenticity that you have as an educator, including a comment from our own Mel Anderson, who says, I think about this sharing some of who we are as a component of authenticity as it pertains to being trustworthy as educators, of advancing a form of allyship with our learners, which I think is really exactly what you were trying to say. Just lots of kudos here, incredible talk. And a question too, can we access your lectures via Zoom for further learning? So maybe we'll send some links out after this. I got an important takeaway from you that students are someone else's kid, which I think is also a reminder that teachers are somebody else's kid too, and sort of tying that into the two-way thing. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about kind of what you say in those weeks leading up to the launch, as I'm looking around the classroom at some of our teachers and thinking, maybe we need to do what she does.
Oh, absolutely. So some of the things I sort of, I welcome them to the new semester. I give them a little bit about kind of what the course is going to be about, what we're going to cover very basically. I mean, they can see the syllabus, but I also tell them how excited I am to meet them. And I tell them, again, a little bit about how the class will run. I explain that you're going to be talking to your classmates. I explain why that's important. So I try to kind of hype them up prior to the class starting. And maybe a little bit about me. I like to save that, as my students on here would know, I like to save that to the first day where I ask them to tell me an interesting fact. They all hate that. I love it. But, and so they have to deal with it. But yeah, so it's mostly just sort of a preamble, and mostly really just to introduce myself and to get them excited.
Great. Dr. Lowenstein, you have a question?
Thank you so much for being here. And I remember when JJ first, in front of all of our new faculty, talked about them being someone's child. And I have a question for you that I actually was going to ask JJ, but now I'm going to ask you. And it's about names and pronunciations, because all of the things that you talked about, engaging the students, noticing them, having them be noticed, in other words, touching on their lives, is harder if we can't pronounce their names. And we have a student here who just submitted a paper about how, and the title was, "It All Begins with Our Name." And one of the lines is, "If you can learn to say choledocholithiasis, my name should not be out of reach." And the data from Zoom learning is that people who have difficult to pronounce names are called on less, and that's especially true in popcorn introductions. They are left last. So I just wondered if you have ideas for that, and how we can, I guess, get closer to these students, but starting with being able to say their name.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point. And I am a little bit famous for butchering people's names. And Zoom actually made it a little easier because you can see their name at the bottom. Now it's much harder back in the classroom. What I found is students don't mind being asked. So I will ask, and I will make notes to myself. I will phonetically write it out, and then I will practice. And so I'm almost probably the opposite, because those are the names that I actually know in the classroom because I've worked on it. For me, the hard thing now is what at least in Arizona, we're still all wearing masks to teach. And, so I'm trying to do it by eyes, and, but I do take copious notes, and I do try to write that. But I think it's a huge issue, and I can absolutely see. It's the same thing. I would probably call on people who have their cameras on more than I call people who have their cameras off. And we don't want to force people. I mean, there's obviously reasons, pro and con, for cameras, but it is something that I always have to remember. And so I think it's good to always keep that in your head.
And I appreciate that, because what you said is I work on it. So it's just something that we can be very intentional about.
Yeah, no, I think we have to be, and I think that's a great comment. Thank you. Kara first, and then sorry.
I want to share out what JJ taught me about what you just asked. I don't have very good phonetics, and he told me to ask the students to help me and to be honest with them about where my limitation was, and that I don't have very good auditory memory. And the first time I really did that outside of Colorado was on job interviews at a college with a large group of students from indigenous backgrounds. And we walked out of that micro class, and the professor was like, "I don't understand how you got that to talk." She never talks. And that's sort of JJ coming through because I had to ask over and over and say, I'm so sorry. Like I told you at the beginning, I have good auditory retention and I can't make phonetic notes because I don't have phonetics. And he told me to just keep asking. And that student then participated in that class within an hour time period. It was a game changer. And so what we do now on the downtown campus is we have students do a flip grid, which is a little self video, and we ask them, how do you want to be called? And we tell them, like, we're testing ourselves over that, because that's the idea I took away from going to the next step of what JJ said on how important it is. But there also is data out there on that change. So, you know, he led the way, always.
Yeah. Loretta?
Thank you so much for sharing. I was wondering if you might be able to tell us a little bit about, you know, before he came to the US, you know, did he have any fantastic mentors that also had an impact on his teaching? Because he sure was amazing.
I'm going to say, yeah, absolutely. I mean, he had a lot of mentors. And actually, some of my students on here know because last January, he talked, the beauty of Zoom was to be able to have my dad come and be the guest at our physiology club. So we had 200 students on Zoom with him, and he decided to talk about mentors. And probably the mentor that meant the most to him over the years was Marty Hoffman, who was a physician at the Royal Vic in Montreal. And my dad bent over backwards to be able to stay with him throughout medical school and his internship. He did everything, and he said it was just, you know, an unbelievable, the man was, you know, a genius, but took my dad under his wing. And I guess this is now, I don't want to totally blow my talk for tonight, but I'm going to blow it a tiny bit. Well, maybe you'll have all forgotten by then. But you know, he always said that one of the saddest things in his life was the fact that he was over in England doing a postdoc when Dr. Hoffman passed away. And he wished with all his heart that he had been able to tell him how much he meant to him, how much Dr. Hoffman meant to my dad, that he wished that he'd been able to tell him that he loved him. And he said at the time he probably wasn't mature enough to do that. But later on, he went to a reunion, and some other people were there, and he was telling that story, and he said, I really wish I'd been able to tell, you know, Marty Hoffman that I loved him. And this person he was talking to said, you know, I think you just did. So I think Marty Hoffman, the kind of fun thing for me is once I started doing a lot of teaching, you know, we sort of became co-mentors. We were sort of back and forth. He always talks about me as being one of his mentors in teaching. And of course, he was my mentor in teaching. And so it was sort of a fun connection that we had.
Zoe, thank you. I'm sure your dad would be really proud today. So this was great. You know, I think active learning is really a breaking tradition style of teaching, especially in a medical school environment, where kind of lecture has been king for so long, and so many people who get lectured to think that the right thing to do is to kind of emulate in some way or another the bad habits that they experienced when they were students. So, you know, I think that it's great, but how would you suggest that faculty be, you know, supported and rewarded and encouraged to kind of break tradition and take a chance on doing something different rather than being what they might feel is comfortable, even though it might be not as effective?
I wish I had an answer for you. I mean, I think we're lucky. I think you're lucky here with people like Dr. Zimmer. We're lucky in Arizona that we have people who believe in this, who probably are willing to put at least, you know, some time and you know, into allowing this to happen and to allow mistakes, because you know it does take time. I think it's very tough in a medical school because we're trying to cover so much information in such a short period of time, not really thinking about how much of this information is the student actually going to retain, right? When I first moved to active learning, one of my mentors in Arizona, he pulled me aside and he said, how much of what you actually say is important? And, and I first said, well, every word that drops from my lips, is a pearl of wisdom that these students need to have. And he just sort of said, really? Okay, well, and it did help me. It was very hard to figure out what I could remove, material-wise, keep the concept so that the students then had that base that they could then, that was easy to get those facts. But I think it's a very tough thing, and I think it's one of the reasons it's taking so long for us to see more changes in higher education. I wish I had a better answer.
There's an amplification of the answer from Dr. Anderson in the chat. Maybe by thinking of ourselves as role models for lifelong learning. If we're not taking those sorts of risks, why should our students? And I think I'll add to that saying that we set the expectation that we're not going to be perfect in the eyes of all of the learners. And I think sometimes the culture feels like, and I want to make sure that I try not to create a culture like that here, where faculty feel that if they take these risks and it doesn't go well, as the literature would suggest it might not in the eyes of the student evaluation, that doesn't mean that we've failed. That actually rewarding the risk, even if it means that the student evaluations are not going to be perfect, in the same way we try to tell the students that when we learn new things, we don't always remember them in exactly the same way. And I think your themes of this being a two-way street and sharing some of the authenticity really speaks to how we could take risks like this that might not be perfect, but that would move the needle forward. And that's hard to do when the expectations are so high and there's accrediting bodies and bosses and all that kind of stuff.
Go. You have to hold it, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have a question. What do you think about the tendency that's happening now with podcasts, webcasts, to spread knowledge? I think I'm speaking because there are many medical professionals or researchers who want to spread their knowledge, and many times within their own institutions, they have a lot of difficulties to teach, whether there's no time, no space, or just they don't care. What do you think about this tendency?
That's a loaded question. I love the idea. I like the idea of being able to share information. Again, it fits so much with what my dad believed in, which is, putting information out for anybody, right? So you don't have to be at a school or in a classroom to learn. I think there can be issues because, again, it's not, vetted as easily. And so there are very often misleading, things out there. And I think that can lead to issues, and it can lead to issues probably for a person who's doing that through their institution. So it's tough. I also do like the fact that, again, we don't have the time. We don't have the time in our classrooms to cover everything, and there's new things that come out and you want to share. I wish I had a better answer. I like it and I don't like it, I guess, is all I can come down to. But I think it's great to be able to share information. I read your Twitter, so I'm on your Twitter page.
There are lots more comments coming in, Zoe, about how proud your dad would have been, and also feedback about how he made people feel. To your opening quote from Maya Angelou, comment here that your father was the first professor on campus that made me feel as an immigrant valued. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Again, remembering that we will all remember how he made us feel. And I'll just add, including the times when he was arguing or disagreeing with us, still making us feel valued and safe and like that we were going to be friends at the end of it. The other, oh, yep, go ahead.
Thank you again for coming. I'm looking forward to your comments later today as well. One of the things that JJ has to have witnessed over time, given sort of the duration he was in the field, is how the public opinion of an expert has changed. And certainly where we live today is one in which, when he began, what was the credibility that was spotted him as an MD PhD in terms of his knowledge and what would be just agreed upon simply because of his expertise. Obviously, we've all experienced that dissipate rapidly. And so your thoughts on his response to that, and then any response you have in terms of maintaining our credibility to an incredibly skeptical public without just telling him to go F off, and because it's not an unreasonable impulse, and yet obviously it's not our better angels. So
Right. No, that's a great point. Yeah. I mean, things have changed so much. Obviously, my dad was here at the University of Colorado for over 50 years, and I mean, technology. Obviously, I mean, I can still remember the first computer. In the lab that took forever, and so sharing information again. Yeah. I think one of the big problems, truthfully, are sort of the open access. A lot of the journals, people can get things published. I think it was one of the big problems that we had with the pandemic. Things were getting published before they were actually reviewed, and I think that's published and then retracted. That sort of wave that we've gotten involved in now that has really diminished our credibility of what we know. I'm trying to think of what he would have thought. I mean, I think he really felt that overall people wanted to learn, and that if you explained it in a way that made sense. And again, I think one of his brilliances was his ability to take any topic and make it understandable. If you were a PhD, if you were the custodian, it didn't matter. He could talk to you and make you feel like you're understanding what's going on. And I think we need that. I think one of the things that can sometimes happen is people in higher education forget we're in a little bubble, and we forget that people outside of that bubble don't have that basic knowledge, and we have to share that. And I think if we do it in a way that is clear and concise and makes sense, that we can hopefully maintain our credibility. But yeah, it's an uphill road, I think, right now, especially with all the ability for people who maybe don't have the same credentials to share things. A little scary sometimes, yeah.
Question over there.
Yeah, just a comment to add to Ross, and as well as your question here, I didn't catch your name, about who Dr. Cohen's mentors were. But one of the first things that I did when in the era of social media and being in the corporate world was, one way that I can remember him is going on LinkedIn, and that's where you find that he has been, in this teaching span and discovery span for 50 years. And I think, over 50 years ago, and you look at his education at McGill, he took Psych 101 with Donald Hebb and neuroanatomy from Wilder Penfeld, who was the individual expert who mapped the functional regions of the brain. And so now in what I do in my world of pharma development and oncology in corporate America, when they come and ask me my credentials and are often challenging this, I simply tell them I was taught immunology by J.J. Cohen. And so when we're talking about apoptosis, as we are in BRAF fusion mutations in my new role with a pediatric oncology company in South San Francisco, that's enough to get credibility, at least in our world.
Yeah, I have to say, I was able to get my minor in immunology because I took my dad's class here with the medical students, so.
Really a perfect way to end. Thank you so much. Zoe, I wanted to tell you one last thing, which is that I did get to tell him that I loved him and that the students here at CU School of Medicine, many of them are doctors and faculty members or current students now, also loved him very much. And I just wanted to thank you for sharing your wisdom, but also for allowing us to honor him and reflect today. One more round of applause. There were 200 people here today.